You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Hello again, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you are listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I have a guest today that I'm real excited about talking to. He is a military veteran. He's a pilot, and for those of you who will be looking in our video, he's got one of his birds in the background there, and I'll let him elaborate on his story. His name is Anthony Bourke, but he goes by AB, and I'm guessing that's an old throwback to the military days. But AB, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be here.
Yeah, so as is a little bit of a custom on this show, give us a little bit of the backstory and your journey into what you're doing today, and then we'll get a lot more into what you're doing today.
Sure, happy to. As you somewhat alluded to, I'm a former U.S. Air Force F-16 pilot. I flew, and as you also alluded to, the F-16 is the airplane right behind me. That's actually taken during a Homeland Defense mission about a week after September 11th, obviously over the skies of San Francisco. I flew 5 years on active duty, and actually my first couple of years I flew in the F-4 Phantom, and then I flew 15 years in the reserves, specifically with the 144th Fighter Wing of the California Air National Guard, based in beautiful Fresno, California, where I lived and raised a family. And I bring that up because when you get off the active duty and you join a reserve F-16 squadron, you're certainly very warmly welcomed, but pretty quickly your squadron commander takes you aside and says, "Hey, new guy, time to go find yourself a real job." And that's a little bit of a shocker. Unlike most of my squadron mates who all pursued careers as United Airlines pilots or Delta Airlines pilots, I chose a different path, which was to start and build at least what I thought were great businesses. And so I got involved with opening the branch of a mortgage bank in the Central Valley for a company called Weyerhaeuser Mortgage. And we grew that branch very dramatically. In fact, I became their top producing mortgage banker in the Western United States. And I don't know why I left that industry, but it was very good to me. But somehow I got roped into another startup, a California-based startup, not particularly sexy. This was a family paint manufacturing business. And this family wanted to figure out how to sell their paint through the Home Depot. And they hired me and another fighter pilot to help them do that. I ran the Western U.S. He ran the Eastern U.S. And that business grew quite dramatically as well. We were successful in landing an account with Home Depot, and that actually ultimately turned into having 40 feet of space in every Home Depot west of Minneapolis, which when I left was about 420 stores, and kind of a rapid revenue growth from zero to $70 million in revenue. And so with that came traditional growth trajectory, hiring great people, building a strategy, executing against that strategy, and getting a team to go in there and every day aligned and flying in formation and helping us grow the business. And so from that, I started to realize that everything we were doing to grow our business, to train our people, to execute and to win was the same thing I was doing in my spare time, if you will, flying F-16s. And so from there, I started a management training company with a couple other fighter pilots, and we grew that business pretty dramatically over the course of 11 years. We got to a place where we had 50 men and women fighter pilots working for us. We were putting on about 300 programs a year, interactive team building programs, half day, full day, multi-day events, keynote speeches, corporate coaching and consulting, all around this idea of flawless execution. I sold that business in 2007, had a non-compete for a couple years. So I took a couple years off for good behavior. And then in 2009, I started this current business, which you've referenced, which is called Mach 2. And now it's just me, and I deliver keynote speeches about 40 to 50 times a year around this idea of peak performance. How is it that fighter pilots achieve peak performance in a very rapidly changing, complex environment, flying jets? And how can businesses, how can organizations use some of those same tools and techniques to achieve peak performance, to drive better results, to execute and win in what we know can be a very challenging and sometimes a very rapidly changing environment in business. So hopefully that's a little backstory for you and gives your viewers a sense of my background.
Well, certainly, let me say it's a little bit cliche, but nonetheless, very important. Thank you for your service and continued effort there and experience. I do say, I frequently get asked by new clients. I too have a brief chapter in life in the military, and it's interesting how often that becomes the line item on a bio page that people gravitate toward, and they say, I'm leading this business and I don't have any experience in the military, but intuitively I believe you can show me something that I don't know that I need help with. And the fair answer is maybe so. I mean, there's some good discipline and good practice that you do learn in that military experience because, as you said, it's ultimately about peak performance and execution when you are in the military, whether you're flying a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment or even on the ground maneuvering and doing things. There's practice, there's repetition, there's discipline, there's planning, there's then finally execution, and all of those things certainly apply in the business world. And all too often, people will try to short circuit some of that and just jump straight to the bottom line. And as we all know, that seldom works. Every once in a while, you hit lightning in a bottle and you get a good outcome, but not usually.
Yeah, I mean, if at least I believe if you can build a team and get them aligned and flying in formation around a mission or a vision, and you put some processes in place to keep them working together, to keep them flying in formation, they'll run through walls for you, and B, you'll overcome all of the obstacles, all of the challenges that we constantly face in business. But having some process, having some discipline around the way your team works, the way your team executes, the language that they speak, are all tools that I took from the military and have successfully translated to other businesses. And it certainly worked for me, and we know it can work for others.
So let's break these down a little bit. You've alluded to it, but I want to call it out specifically. And I'm an advocate of the idea. It does start with the definition of mission or vision, and as Stephen R. Covey famously says, you got to begin with the end in mind. What do you think you want to accomplish? And you have to paint that picture to get the team moving in the same direction, moving toward that outcome. And all too often, leaders, in my humble opinion, don't spend, at least in the business world, don't spend enough time really crystallizing that message and being able to define what a win is going to look like.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, if I were to go back and think about developing a vision in business, and this is somewhat different in the military, but it aligns pretty well. I think getting your team as involved in developing the strategy and the vision together is step one. Because if they've had some inputs, if they've been involved in helping you decide, here's where we're trying to go, here's how we want to do it, here's what we want to look like, here's what we want to sound like, here's how we want to work together. Right off the bat, you've got buy-in. So, in many cases, many heads are better than one. Dictatorship, we found, hasn't really succeeded in the long term. So, getting buy-in on from the team on your vision and having them help you with that. And then, of course, agreeing as a team how we're going to execute against that vision. And as a leader, I think one of our big challenges is, fear of redundancy. But I think great leaders send the same message. They say the same thing over and over and over again so it resonates with their people. Because otherwise you get what I call mission creep. And people are heading in the direction that you want, and then suddenly they start doing things just a little bit differently, in ways that we perhaps know aren't going to be as effective. And yet it's like, well, they do it that way in Houston, and I think we can do it this way in San Francisco. And it's all good. It's a little bit easier, by the way, and nobody really minds. And you get mission creep, and we lose our standards that make us great. So at least in my mind, I believe in a culture of driving continuous improvement, starting from our core beliefs and then trying to get just a little bit better every day. And at least in the military and in most businesses I've worked in or run, I have a mantra around this idea of a feedback loop of continuous improvement, which is essentially a culture, a cadence of regular briefing and debriefing. And, you're a military man yourself, Doug. This is not speaking French to you, but in my mind, briefing essentially says, you know what? You may be the best and the brightest fighter pilot in the world. You could have the greatest ideas or tactics or plans in your head. But as a leader, if you haven't found a way to communicate your great plans, your great ideas to the people who are going to be flying with you, or of course, in the business world, the people who are either working for you or with you, then all of your ideas will be for naught, because you'll be flying solo and so will your wingman. And that's why when fighter pilots get ready to fly any kind of mission, whether it's a 1-hour training mission or a 6-hour combat mission, even though we've been preparing for hours for our missions, or in so many cases, we've been preparing for days or even weeks for our missions, just before we get ready to take off, or maybe better put in business language, just before you get ready to execute your day, your week, your key projects, customer meetings and events, fighter pilots always sit down and hold a briefing to ensure that when we walk out the door, jump in our cockpits, put on our helmets, and start engines, that we are going to be aligned, that we're going to be flying in formation, that we're going to execute that mission at the highest possible level, and that the mission's going to be safe, that we're going to bring everyone home safely at the end of the day. So I personally love talking to businesses about the power of briefing, how fighter pilots use it to keep the team aligned and flying in formation, and showing business leaders how continuous briefing, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, is a way to reinforce our messages, our vision, our standards, and keep the team pointed in the right direction. So that's number one. And then, in this idea of getting better every day, fighter pilots have a saying, and that is, when the mission is over, at the end of the day, at the end of the mission, no fighter pilot has ever flown the perfect mission. And I think it's probably fair to say none of your viewers are ever going to have the perfect day, week, month, customer interaction, or event. And that's why when fighter pilots are done executing our missions, we always, always, always call time out and hold a debrief. So we can learn from both the mistakes and the victories of today's mission, and we can continue to improve as individuals, certainly as a broader team, but I think most importantly, so as leaders, we can find a way to get the honest real-time feedback we need to keep our team ahead of the threats, ahead of the competition, and ahead of the inevitable change that's going to continue to come our way. That's what I believe.
I like it. And you've said a lot there, and I want to unpack a little bit. So on the early thing you said about casting the vision and getting the team involved in the development of that, I agree with that. On an earlier episode, I was talking about, of late, I've been doing a lot of work in the entrepreneur by acquisition space, and that is individuals who are deciding to leave a corporate job and go buy a business rather than build a business. It gives opportunity to identify, one of the millions and millions of businesses that are getting ready to change hands in the next 10 years as boomers exit and retire. We've got a tremendous level of wealth that's going to change hands, and it's an ideal time for anybody out there that's kind of been teasing and promising or kicking the tires about becoming an entrepreneur. There's some great opportunities, but one of the challenges in doing that, and the things I've observed, is that people get involved in that journey to identify the business, go perform a due diligence on it. They get real balled up in the numbers, trying to negotiate and cut the terms, but they don't think enough about the people side of what they're going to be doing and the team they're going to be inheriting. Yeah, they may get a roster and they may look and say, oh, average tenure here is 8 years. That's great. Well, it is good. That is a good thing. But what are you going to tell those people when on day one, when you show up and go, ta-da, I'm the new owner? What are you going to say to them? Where are you going to start? What's your message? And one of the big things that I coach people to consider is the idea your first message is, ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm a private investor. I bought this business because I think it's a good one. You guys have a great reputation, a great track record. You've had performance. The last thing I want to do is come in here and somehow blow it up. I want you to teach me how you do what you do. Then we're going to work together to decide what our future opportunities may look like, if we're going to expand or grow or do something a little bit different. But fundamentally, we're not going to do anything different because it's been working, and that's why I chose to buy this business. And I think that's a powerful message, and it helps get buy-in from that team right up front. They get a little bit of assurance. The mystery hopefully is minimized about who the new owner is and what they're going to be doing, and come in and they can start implementing those feedback loops. And in respect to what you said, I love that idea, the brief and debrief. Always being sure everybody's on the same page when you get ready to launch and get ready to execute. But as you execute, and if things don't go quite the way you hope they would or planned and thought they would, you've got to have that debrief to take in that feedback and try to refine and adjust accordingly.
Yeah. This is you're making some great points. One of my favorite leaders I've worked with over the years, it's still tattooed in my memory banks. Him, in this case, a male and quite a close friend, getting in front of his team as he was put into the role of president, and looking at them and saying, guys, I don't have any of the answers. You're the experts in this business, and don't think I'm going to tell you how to do it, because without you, nothing's going to happen here. So I'm very interested in your feedback. I need to hear from you. So you tell me how to run this business, because this is your business. I'm overseeing this group, but it's all about you guys. And I thought that was pretty powerful. I'll make a point about debrief, because I think it's really important, Doug. Something that we do in the military, which, as you know, is a very hierarchical organization. So if you're my, commanding officer, General Thorpe, and I'm a young lieutenant, when I see you in the hallway and you tell me to jump, I don't question that. I just say, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. How high? But when we go into a debrief at the end of the mission, at the end of the day, at the end of the week in business, at the end of the sales call, at the end of the project, and the door to the debriefing room closes, something magical happens. In my squadron, literally, name tags come off the chest. They are Velcroed on our flight suits. We tear them off. We throw them down on the table. Rank comes off our shoulders. And we hold a debrief where there is no hierarchy. And the sole purpose is to learn and to get better. So I like to say the debrief is safe. And our goal is to figure out what's working, what's not, and how we can do things just a little bit better tomorrow. So it doesn't matter if you're the general or you're the newest person in the squadron. Everyone's opinion is valid. Everybody can add. And we're going to have some back and forth and, maybe even some contentious discussions. But at the end of that debrief, we're all going to walk out the door with the same lessons learned, pointed in the same direction. And of course, our hierarchy is back in place. So debrief is the safe zone where everybody can be heard and we can get just a little bit better today and tomorrow and the next week, because we know in all of these businesses, we can't fix everything tomorrow, but we can get a little bit better every day with our people's input.
On that point, and at the risk of invoking a little bit of military branch competition here, there is an amazing documentary on Amazon about the Navy Blue Angels.
Yeah.
And if folks listening in earshot here, if you want to see something, go look that one up. It's a great series. It's a short series, but it nonetheless, and half of the episode is them in their briefing and debriefing room, talking about, and to your point about the rank and hierarchy, the guy leading the debrief is not the squadron commander, because commander flies in first position in their formation. But the guy that's got all the data is in the fourth plane back at the tail. He's observed what the formation did during their training and development. So he's kind of got the outline, and he's got the data points to say, when we did this turn, number 3 was high and 2 was low, and we've got to work on that. But again, there's this notion of nobody takes offense at that feedback. It's like we're talking about ways to get better. There's no judgment and ego involved in that.
Well, I'm a huge fan of the Blue Angels. I'm a huge fan of the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard. We have our own services, but in the end, we're all on the same team. So, my father was a Navy A4 pilot. I've been watching the Blue Angels my entire life growing up. And I do think they are a great example. They put on about 100 air shows a year, and they're very talented. They're very well trained. And it comes to, for example, the 90th air show of the year, and the previous 89 essentially went perfect. And yet at the end of that 90th air show, even though they'd love to head to the officers club and go hug a few, babies and sign a few autographs, because there's 100,000 people there dying to meet them. The first thing they do is they go right back in the room where they briefed up the mission. They close the door and they hold a debrief of that perfect air show. Again, talking about what worked today, what didn't, how can we do it just a little bit better for air show number 91? So they never settle. They're constantly trying to get better. And I agree that Amazon series is fantastic. So all of your viewers should take time to watch it. They're real superstars.
Yeah. Well, and to the point here, I think when you see examples of these processes and practices that help create obvious high-level performance, there's something behind it. It doesn't just happen. And everybody can go out individually and practice and rehearse and do their maneuvers and learn their technical skills. But until the team can come together and execute, not to beat word pictures to death, but I had a client the other day, we were talking about, it turns out he and his CEO both have children that are in competitive rowing in college at the athletic scholarship level. And we got to talking about the analogies of how a crew in competitive rowing comes together and the different things. And the obvious analogy is when you see that everybody's rowing in rhythm, their movements are very synchronized, but it takes a whale of amount of practice to get there and make that happen. But also communication, discipline, practice, feedback, all of those things. And from time to time, there's competition to move up in the seats on the boat. There's there are opportunities that individual contributors can step up and advance in the crew. So a lot of analogies in anything like that fit the business realm as well. So really good stuff.
You made a nice point about with the Blue Angels that it wasn't the boss, the squadron commander that led the debrief, that it was number four. And it's so interesting because I think that applies very well in business too. The boss may not be seeing everything that's going on. He or she's at a high level. I found when I became a leader of any organization, I seemed to get taller. I seemed to get smarter. I seemed to get funnier. Everything I said was brilliant. And it was very hard for me to get honest, real-time feedback. And in fact, your people know what's going on, but you have to find some system to get them to speak up, whether it's, as you say, having number four, who's watching everything lead your debriefs, whether it's having your executive assistant sit down with you once a week, closing the door and giving you honest real-time feedback because you require it, you demand it. Who is your mentor today when you're president or CEO? You use mentors to get all the way to the top. But if you don't ask for feedback when you get to the top, you're really going to be thinking that you're the smartest person on the planet because that's what you're going to hear a lot of the time. So debrief is critical to helping leaders get better and helping an organization work through challenges, get on the same page, and keep moving forward.
I think one of the big challenges individually is people that are at the top of the organization, whether they were the founder and built it up, or whether they were somehow hired into that role, there is a risk of the ego kicking in and a mindset that doesn't allow enough of that open, honest feedback to happen. And I think that's potentially one of the biggest risks that anybody, particularly in the entrepreneurial world, those who become founders and they see a business blossom. I talk about this a lot in my banking days. I watched way too many companies start up, do well, and then crash. Mm-hmm. Because the founder could not keep growing with the business. The business exceeded what capacity the founder had, either naturally or even developed. And the founder wasn't willing to make the pivot and call it and say, oh, this is bigger than me. Maybe it's time to go hire a CEO. I'll stay as owner, but I don't need to be the CEO. I'll go hire one that has the execution ability to keep this thing growing and building. Companies that tended to do that obviously kept scaling and kept, their enterprise growth intact. But the ones where the founder couldn't make that pivot, it was a sad demise in most every case. Used to bug the hell out of me as a banker, not because it was potentially costing our bank money for, bad loans, which we had a good way of protecting ourselves against. But I was just sad for the hard work that had been put in over the years to get the business up to a certain point, and it was doing quite well. And then it would crash. It would hit this invisible wall and just implode.
Yeah, that story's been told a few times.
Yep. AB, let's pivot a little bit. And in the work you do, I know you're predominantly speaking now, talking to groups. So we talked about feedback. We talked about the debrief. What else? Is there another thing or two that you're a champion of talking about?
Boy, I talk a lot about safety as well. And I have a talk that I'm very passionate about, which is called "The Chain of Events Always Leads to the Scene of the Accident." And it's based on a personal story when I was a young lieutenant flying the F-4 Phantom and got thrown into a training mission at the last minute where we were going to go fly a low level out over Western Pennsylvania. And I went to help the flight lead prepare, and he asked me to make some color maps of the route we would be flying. And I went to the color copier machine, and after I made, in this case, we had 8 crew members because there's 2 people in every airplane, and it's a 4-ship. After I made 6 copies, the color copier went kaput, and I had to make the last 2 on a black and white copier, kind of a vintage black and white copier with very poor quality. I went back in, I told my flight lead, I've got these maps, 2 of them are really lousy quality. And he said, well, no problem. You're number 4. You're the lieutenant. You'll take the lousy maps. You're just going to be flying formation anyway, so you don't really need to navigate. And so we briefed up the mission. We stepped out to our jets. When I got to my jet, I had a mechanical problem that meant I had to abort that jet and go to another jet. Well, while we're making that switch, the other 3 pilots are headed out to the runway to take off. I get in a brand new airplane, start it up, get on the radio, let my flight lead know that I'm in a new jet. I had a mechanical problem, and I was coming as quick as I could. He said, well, that's fine. We're going to take off. We're going to head out to the air refueling tanker. You catch up to us when you can. So we do that. We taxi out, and as I'm taxiing out to the runway, I said to my backseater, this reminds me a lot of all the safety briefings we were given in pilot training, where they tell you, 3 strikes and you're out. So if you have 2 strikes, it's time to probably take a look at what's going on and say, we've got a bad situation developing. Maybe we should throttle back. Maybe we should do something different. Maybe we should think about things in a different way. And so we got to the end of the week. We'd obviously had the black and white color map. I'd been thrown in the mission at the last second. I've now aborted a jet for mechanical problems. I'm in a spare, and my flight lead and all the pilots have left me. That feels like 2 strikes to me. So we sat at the end of the runway in what we call last chance, and just kind of pulled our maps back out and said, if we get a 3rd strike while we're flying, what are we going to do? Well, so we wrote down all the radio frequencies along the route of who we would call if we had a problem. And we wrote down the nav aids of where we would go if we had a problem. And then we took off. And as we passed 18,000 feet, I checked in with my flight lead and said, I'm on the way to the tanker, which was about 300 miles away. And he said, great, we've all got our gas. We're going to go fly the low level. You get your gas and you fly it by yourself. And of course, I'm a brand new 2nd lieutenant. I've never flown this low-level route. I've never seen it. I'm totally mission-driven, like so many of your viewers. I'm going to get it done. But this is a new scenario for me. So we go get gas. We head onto the low-level route, and it is the most beautiful day in Western Pennsylvania you've ever seen, kind of almost this time of year, September. The leaves are changing. It's absolutely beautiful. And on the last leg of the low-level, the flight plan calls me to push up the speed from 480 knots, which is basically 8 miles a minute, to 540 knots, which is 9 miles a minute, drop down from 500 feet to 300 foot above the ground, and ingress in below radar coverage before we pop up and drop our bombs on this new target. And suddenly, as I'm flying along, bam! I have no idea what's happened, but the whole cockpit turns white. I know something's terribly wrong. I don't know what it is, but all my training kind of kicks in. Number 1, climb to cope, get away from the ground. That's dangerous. And speed is life. So I push up the afterburner, pull the nose 45 degrees nose high, and I'm just, going straight up at about 10,000 foot per minute. It's very loud in the cockpit. So I'm trying to say to my backseater, are you okay? What's happened? But I cannot communicate with him. I squawk emergency. I put in those frequencies and TACAN aids, nav aids, to an airport that I know is a safe place to land. And as I pass 10,000 feet, I realize, man, it's awful loud in here. I pull the power back and try to slow down. As I slow down, I can now hear my backseater. I say, are you okay? He says, yeah. I said, what happened? He said, I think we hit some power lines. And I said, well, that's impossible. Wow. How could that be? And he says, not only that, but your canopy is shattered right above your head. and your drogue chute of your ejection seat is popped out and flapping down the side of the airplane. And I'm thinking, well, that's not good, because maybe the ejection sequence has started, and boy, if this thing goes, I'm going to be like Goose in Top Gun 1. I'm just going to smash into that canopy and be toast. So to make a long story endless, we declare an emergency. I safely land the airplane. We pull off on the side of the runway, and we're unable to lift the canopy. And I'm afraid to lift the canopy because I think that could cause the ejection seat to actually fire. And so we got a radio relay to my squadron, sent out life support. They helped me get out. They actually used a crash axe and shattered the whole canopy so we could both get out. Fortunately, that story ends rather happily in that we're both alive. In the end, we debriefed this thing, including taking a helicopter the next day, flying to that spot, hovering right in front of those power lines. And it was actually a whole field of like 200 power lines going across this river valley. But hovering there with the sun angle the way it was, those power lines were essentially invisible. And of course, I never saw them on the black and white map because it was so poor quality. So no one took away from me that I should not have hit those power lines. Fortunately, I was flying at a legal altitude on a legal route, so I wasn't a criminal. But we went back and looked and said, my gosh, look how many things happened before you ever got to those power lines, that if anyone in the squadron, flight lead, wingman, squadron supervision, even crew chiefs had said, we got a lot of things that aren't going right. Let's throttle this mission back and do something else. That incident never would have happened. And so we use this speech for, people that work in construction. We use this speech for people that work in oil and gas or nuclear power. But more and more, we're talking about these lessons for executive teams who, for example, are getting involved in trying to push for a merger or an acquisition. And everybody's mission driven and they're just pushing forward. And yet there's so many signs, there's so many strikes coming up where maybe we should say, this ain't working. Let's just call time out and either abort the mission or do something a little bit differently, because this deal could take the whole company down if it's not successful.
Yeah.
So that's one I'm quite passionate about and really enjoying speaking to companies about.
Well, great story, AB, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm thankful that it did have that happier ending. And but as you were telling it, the whole three strike idea, boy, I can think of a lot of scenarios in my own experience where objectives and projects that we were working on, wanted to do, just one thing after another was not working, and pressing forward inevitably, it didn't always turn out the way you wanted it to. And thankfully nobody's life was in peril, but the ultimate business purpose or outcome did not achieve what everybody had hoped it would. So I think there's a lot to be said for that three strike rule. And I guess the one caveat I'll add, and please chime in if you disagree, but taking that pivot, taking that pause at the three strike or two strike mark and reevaluating doesn't mean you're not going to live another day and go out tomorrow and restart and try it again. But it just means that the path you're on right now needs to be postponed, stopped, diverted, whatever.
Yeah, could be fatal. Could be fatal for the business.
Yep. Well, AB, thank you so much. We're about up on our time for today, but tell people the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in hiring you for one of their events and having you come and share some of these great stories.
Oh, gosh. Thanks so much, Doug. There are a number of ways to get a hold of me. My website is mach2consulting.com. Mach, of course, is spelled M as in Mike, ACH, the number 2, consulting.com. I think your viewers can see my name spelled right on my screen there. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on YouTube, all sorts of places. And so that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, one last time, AB, thanks again for sitting in, and thank you for your wisdom and experience. And folks, this is the part of the show I always like to tell you, if you're listening on your favorite streaming service, we do have a video version of this over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Jump over there, check out the archives, and let us know if you've got some ideas or questions about other topics or other speakers you'd like to see on this show. I would be happy to entertain that. And you can reach me on all of my social media links too. That's Doug Thorpe, Thorpe. Website is dougthorpe.com. Hop over there. I got a lot of information to share with you. But for now, we're going to sign off, say goodbye. Go out there and make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.